My name is Betsy Cross. I live in Wall Township. And since it is a budget presentation, I'm going to ask you, Mr. Ebenezer, if I could go over the 5 minutes, because I've got a number of items. I want to be sure I go over them carefully with you. So would you allow that tonight?
It's a budget discussion, so tonight's budget is not set in stone. It's a working document. We don't even have our state aid yet. So this is just an overview of what everything's about. So we're not getting into everything that pertains to this budget yet.
Yeah, but we don't even have any handouts of the numbers, which is a big problem. I bring this up every year. This is, I think, my 8th year bringing it up. It would have been helpful if those figures were online. All right, let me just get right into it. I did get back the attorney bills for Mr. Gross. And I'm a little bit concerned, you went into executive session before and you didn't have Mr. Gross here. Did you have an attorney in the back with you because you were discussing litigation or contract matters or attorney-client privilege and personnel matters? So you should always have an attorney present. Is anybody an attorney on the board that was back there? And can I see a show of hands who was back there? You haven't arrived yet. You were back there?
That's not a
Christine,
question.
you back there? I know, but, I mean, yeah, people should have been here. You went into executive session, you know, all the people. So that is concerning, so make sure you document that properly. I did get the attorney bills back for December. And it looks like there was a subpoena issued, and it's not very clear. It does say subpoena for records, receipt and review of correspondence, and I'm not really sure what it is. Old subpoenas, you know, Wall's gotten plenty of attorneys, subpoenas in the past. It would say subpoena for attorney records, but this does not say what it's for. So I'm guessing it's for the Central School trailers because on December 3rd, it is redacted in the minutes from Mr. Gross. So just have been getting the runaround for 6 months now, so I'm glad to see that there are some subpoenas issued. Have some questions. Last year's budget, the 1920, you were purchasing a number of items, and they were high school alarm smoke detectors for $40,000, replacing doors at intermediate school Allen Wooded Central, and West Belmar, you were painting the outside. I put in for the purchase orders because I wanted to see them. My son is in the high school. I'm concerned, of course, obviously with the smoke detectors and all the other kids in the doors, and only a purchase order came back for Central School door. So if Mr. Smythe can go over, did we purchase the smoke detectors and we just didn't create a purchase order for $40,000? What the price was? Why don't we have purchase orders? It's now close to March. So, I mean, these items are very important and they should have been purchased by now. So I'm going to give Mr. Smythe the highlights of the 1920 budget that details every item that you were going to be spending, and if Mr. Smythe could go over tonight, every line item to say what he actually spent. So by now, you should have that, and I'm sure the board, I'm sure you went through it all, and you have those same questions. I did get back the bid today for removal of the trailers. I was shocked to see that William Cole Construction never even went to the site. He didn't sign in that he was there on January 27th. I'm in complete shock. He just threw out a number of $173,000. Lurch was there, he signed in, and he did not provide a quote. So if Mr. Smythe, I'm sure they've said now why they didn't provide a quote, and if he didn't, I would like somebody on the board to go back to Mr. Smythe to find out why didn't Lurch quote this? They went and visited. Why didn't they quote it? And when are you going to go out for requotes? What I don't want is anybody in Wall Municipal touching anything. So hopefully they got subpoenas as well, because the runaround that has been going on between Wall Municipal and the Board of Ed on the Central School trailers issue, nobody should be touching anything, and the entire job should be taken out of Mr. Smythe's hands. Out of his hands completely. I think you should have a state monitor now sitting here, based upon what I've seen. Just on the trailers. Mr. Smythe did deny information regarding the trailers, and in the bills, I do see that what I'm asking for, you should have been able to send me back, because you actually put it in your minutes. I mean, in his bill, he charged you for it, but you did not return it to me. So there's going to be a list of things that you could actually be charged against just regarding the Oprahs, which I do not want to do. But it's clear as day there's a violation. If you could go over how much you're budgeting for Superintendent Dyer, how much you're budgeting for the business administrator. Brian Smythe is an annual contract. He does not have to get the same amount of money he has. I'm seeing cutting it by 75,000, like that. So it should be a big cut in Mr. Smythe based upon what's happened in the past 6 months just here and what's happened in the past decade. Could you go over how much you have budgeted in these binders so you can say it, tell us tonight? Could you go over how much you have for judgments against the school district? We still have another lawsuit pending. I see a couple more in bills. So if you could go over what is budgeted in that binder tonight for judgments against the school district, I'd like to hear the amount. I jotted a couple other, if you could go over how much WTEA estimated salaries are going to be and admin salaries are going to be. I did write down the numbers. I think you spent $46 million in payroll in 2019. So if you could go over all of those numbers. If you could go over health insurance, I'd like to know what you have budgeted for health insurance for 2021. I was shocked when I saw that $9 million check, and now Mr. Smythe is saying my request is too vague. He can't provide any of the payments that he made for December that he was holding up, it seems, for health insurance. So I did put that in writing as well. I'd like to get all these answers back tonight. And Mr. Smythe, I'm sure you've been writing them down feverishly, and I'll be waiting for your responses. What else do I have? Could you go over when you're going to go out for rebids on the trailers? If you could give us a date of when you're going to do that. I'm not even comfortable having anybody in the county do anything if they're going to be cherry-picked on undoing electrical and plumbing and things like that.
Ms. Cross, your time is up. Thank you.
And I would have more items if I had more time. So before I leave, if you could go over those questions, I would appreciate it. If I don't get them tonight, please send them back to me in writing tomorrow or your earliest convenience, Friday being the latest. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Kathleen Duran. I live in Wall Township. I would like to pick up sort of where Betsy left off in saying that it was not helpful that I couldn't find any of the amounts on the website tonight, so I can't ask any really constructive questions, but I do have some general ones. One would be how much we are budgeting to pay the new superintendent. How much are we budgeting for Brian? I happen to concur with Betsy that there should be a financial penalty to Brian if he is even retained based on his failure to provide a timeline or an honest timeline as to what transpired with the trailers. And also if there's any budget allowance made for a grant writer. There is money to be had out there. I see the state advertising for grant writers constantly, all sorts of positions, full-time and part-time. And I think Wall could benefit from grabbing some of the pieces of the pie that are out there. I'd also like to know the amount of any judgments against the district, what's been budgeted, and what's been budgeted for admin, healthcare, teachers. I know those figures all eventually go to the Department of Education, but I'd like to have public input prior to those numbers being submitted. I always end up calculating them at the end, where I'd like this time to be upfront with it, because when I look at you at the end and you all stare back at me and I say, well, this is pretty atrocious compared to every other single school district, not just the ones that are cherry-picked by Cheryl Dyer, it's better to tackle these head-on and see where the money is evaporating? Where's the crack that it's falling through? Why does it cost more to educate students here than in every other district that surrounds us, even the ones that are higher and lower on the socioeconomic scale? It just costs too much, and that bespeaks, like any household budget, that bespeaks multiple small bad decisions. I'd like to be out in front of that and may be able to make a helpful criticism. And by not having the numbers out here, I can't do input. I can only say at the end, well, here I ran the numbers again, and it would be my 5th year doing it, showing that we are an atrocity. We are an abomination. Why should it cost more to educate students here than Brielle, Manasquan, Seagirt, Spring Lake, Manalapan, any Summit, Milburn? Just pick a town. It doesn't matter. They're all, I've done it by 15 different towns, and we can't seem to get out in front of it. And what that is bad decision making, and it's not getting controlled. In terms of, I went over what Betsy had Oprah'd, and I'm concerned with what's not being returned to her. I'm concerned because it exposes you to a lawsuit by her that you shouldn't be exposed to if these are handled properly. But you can't redact, you can't have it in an attorney bill where it's a subpoena for records, then you're redacting in the minutes where you're talking to the attorney about the trailers. The attorney records should have that a subpoena was received regarding trailers or regarding construction. I went back to 2017, and other subpoenas always say the item. They don't give you the details. We're not privy to that, but it says the item. If it was an employment or a personnel action, it says, subpoena relating to personnel action, subpoena relating to employment, subpoena relating to what it's relating to. This whole thing strikes like hide, 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 and no transparency again, because I suspect that this is a subpoena. Now, if I've walked myself into a conversation that I'm not privy to, i.e., is this a criminal subpoena? I don't know. I have no idea. And then you wouldn't have to return it. But it doesn't say that. It doesn't say civil or criminal. And the fact that it's civil or criminal is not super secret. We're not super secret spies. This is for transparency. What is it? We don't get the details, I understand, but the label we get. Even when you have attorney-client privilege, the fact that you had a meeting with an attorney is not privileged. You get to you have to say the name of the attorney and the date and so forth. You don't get the content of the conversation. I'm looking for the label. And I'm not seeing the label. I'm not seeing it returned, and that's a good faith requirement that's upon you. Now, I also noticed in Brian's February 18, 2020 Oprah response to Betsy that he denied that there are any letters going to state agencies and so forth, but this contradicts your attorney bills, where he's billing you for writing letters to state agencies. All right? Someone's lying. Either your attorney's billing for work not actually conducted, or Brian's lying on his Oprah return. So let's figure it out. It's really tedious to have to keep pointing it out to you, but it's not acceptable. It's one or the other. They can't both be telling the truth. So either Brian's lying or Gross is lying. On operations and facilities, the highlight of the tentative budget, I share Betsy's concern about the smoke detectors. I want to know why $40,000 was budgeted last year and not spent. I want to know why Brian Smith asked you and told you last year we needed these smoke alarms, then didn't spend the money, why it was budgeted and why not spent. And if it was handled, there's $40,000, you reach that level where there should be backup documentation, no question, maybe even a bid. Nothing is returned under Oprah. There's nothing. So do the fire alarms work in any building? Because right now, based on what Mr. Smythe asked last year when he said we needed to replace them, I say no. So here we go again around the mulberry bush. Don't tell me they're not working in one meeting. Ask for my money to pay for it, not spend it, and then not tell me why. Do they magically repair themselves? Did somebody volunteer their time? It's ridiculous. Only one budgeted expense was made, and that was to fix a door for $10,000. What happened to the other 30? Where is it? And also finally, as to the site inspection by this one company that just put in a bid, the William Cole Construction, putting in a removal bid without visiting the site calls it into question. So I would like to know what the expected date of any rebid is. And I, for one, Betsy doesn't deal with it, but I am still waiting for a corrected timeline that Mr. Smythe said would be forthcoming. He said the documents were just, in history, in the archives. You had to retrieve them. So it's a couple months later. Where are the documents? Where's the timeline? Because you had an attorney that you hired to $400 and some an hour to look into this. Then you fired that attorney, so now nobody's looking into it. Well, I'm going to look into it. So I want that timeline so I can get the Oprah requests out for all the documents so that anyone in town who cares what happens with those trailers and they want answers can have answers. And the timeline is key to that. By
Thank Mr. Ann, your time is up.
Okay, I don't think withholding information is okay. And I think that ought to be reflected in his salary going forward, if you even hire him again. Thanks.
Thank you. Anybody else for public comment? Seeing none, I'll close it. I had asked about subpoenas a while ago, so I have a couple notes on that. So there's various types of subpoenas the district receives. We receive for student records, employment records, district records. So all subpoenas fall under litigation or pending or threatened litigation. And as a result, the district will not comment or specify as to any subpoenas for records received by the district and shared with council. The notation on the attorney's bill was generic for that reason. It simply identifies the work that was being done and the time spent. It could not and will not indicate the type of case or circumstances. So that's what subpoenas.
Your executive minutes say.
Please don't call out, please.
Get your bills
Please. Mr. Smythe, do you, with Lurch, one, we don't control if people go out and look or if they submit bids, but did you have an opportunity to talk to them as to why they didn't bid?
Lurch Construction was a contractor that bid with William Cole Construction. So they were the demolition contractor that was working with William Cole Construction on the bid.
Okay, so they didn't put their own separate bid in?
Correct.
Okay, all right. And in regards to us going back out to bid, do we have a timetable for that yet, or we?
We're currently reviewing other opportunities
Okay.
to have the trailers removed before going out to bid.
Okay.
Somebody else
And
has
then,
to handle it.
and then, all these other things will be addressed
How about
in the budget.
Smoke detectors, that should be very simple. Are they
Is there any, with the smoke detectors that we budgeted, what came with those? Was that a bid that we rejected?
No, there was not a bid that was rejected. The fire alarm system at the high school and as well as all the school buildings are operational. We are currently in the middle of the 2019-20 school year, which these projects or these items were budgeted in. So
Okay. So
where we
they're just
currently
not,
stand.
just not projects that have been done yet, possibly? Okay.
That's concerning. Fire alarm.
Mr. Smythe, could you comment, I think you answered this in general, but the $9 million for the insurance that was, that Ms. Cross mentioned about the $9 million last month, which seemed relatively high compared to previous months. And I think
Yeah.
you answered it. I've heard the answer, but I was hoping you could explain to the public.
Well, just as a correction, it was not a $9 million check. The cash disbursements for the month were $9 million, which is higher than our usual, which is between 5.5 or 6 and 7 million. And that was because we issued payments for our health benefit claims to Horizon in that month, which was more than just 1 month's worth of claims. They were delayed on their billing, so we paid multiple months, and that's why it was so high.
Why can't you provide them? 'Cause I opened
Ms.
up-
Cross, please don't yell out.
Well, I would like the board to ask them why we couldn't
It's not time for public comment.
I said
That we already went through that, so thank you.
ask him to get back to me.
Ms. Cross, we're having a meeting. The audience doesn't call out. Thank you.
Get the answers.
All right, Mr. Smythe, at this time, would you like to give an overview and have a discussion on the budget?
Absolutely. All right. So the information that was provided at the end of last week to the board members, the budget projection reports and the budget projection account details reports, that's the information that we have at this point in time. This is a working document. This is going to be a process between now and the public hearing on April 28th. The one interim date, because we've discussed the budget calendar, is the submission of a tentative budget, which we have a board meeting on March 17th that will be looking to approve a tentative budget for submission to the Department of Education. And again, that's a tentative budget, and between that tentative budget being approved and the public hearing at the end of April, it'll continue to be a working document, and we'll be able to make what changes that we deem necessary during that process. We do have a number of new board members this year. So the first thing I wanted to do and what we wanted to discuss with regard to, or use this meeting for, was to give an overview of the budget structure, perhaps explain the account codes and what they mean and why they exist, and then go into, on a broad brush, from a broad brush view, the revenues and the appropriations where we stand today, with the revenues being broken down in a little bit more detail. So with regard to the budget structure, there was information that was handed out to that was provided to the board, understanding the school budget accounts, and although I'm not going to read through all the information or the slides, the second slide of the handout breaks down the structure on how the budget is set up. And we provide the tabs for you so that you can go through the different categories, tuition, educational support, administration, and so on. If there's any questions at any point in time with regard to any of this information, don't hesitate and stop me, and you can ask. And I'll just go through them briefly. With regard to the first category being tuition, that'll be for the out-of-district tuition. That's to other LEAs, the majority of which is for special education, but it does also include students that attend the Monmouth County Vocational School District or the academy. So those numbers are included in there as well. Which the value of that, with regard to the out-of-district tuition, which we'll talk about in more detail, is approximately $2.7 million. So we do spend some significant dollars with regard to out-of-district tuition. We have educational support would be the next section of tabs. Those would be the categories that support the education that's going on in the schools, including nursing, occupational therapy, physical therapy, guidance, child study teams, as well as the media center of the library. So all those account numbers will be in 11, a 30, and then the next group of account numbers will be specific to their function. But again, we'll go into that in more detail. We have administration. That's broken down from a central administration, and which would be 230 would be the number that would be significant. 1130 is 240, and don't get too hung up on the numbers. We'll go into that in more detail. But just to know that the next grouping would be building administration. So we are required to categorize our costs, our appropriation, and our expenses down to the building level. So before going through the rest of them, the reason why we do this, this is, every school district in the state of New Jersey is required to do that. We have a minimum chart of accounts that is put out by the Department of Education that we have to adhere to. We can go beyond that minimum chart and be more specific, which we do in a lot of situations, just to better identify where the costs are within our budget. And it's the direction that the state has moved to try to break down costs at the building level. And then one of the main reasons for having the uniform chart of accounts is so that school districts and the State Department of Education can compare districts on an apples-to-apples basis. So every school district charges their instructional classroom supplies to the same account number. It's 11, 190, 100, 610. And then, it gets more specific per school. So the state takes our budget and breaks that down, how much we spend on instructional supplies, and can compare us to similar districts statewide. So every one of these account numbers is specific and has that same purpose. It's so that there's uniformity among all the districts in the state, and it can be compared uniformly throughout the state. So, and then going through, we have operations. We break that down, 261, which is we break it down to required maintenance. We also have custodial services and security, grounds and security. Required maintenance, we are required to budget specific costs into required maintenance, those costs that would be used to prolong the life of the building, as opposed to, say, cleaning the building or doing snow plowing, which would be custodial. So the cost for prolonging the life of the building would go into required maintenance, and if you recall, each fall we approve a comprehensive maintenance plan where we identify those costs that we have expensed on a per building level, as well as what we anticipate in future budgets. And the requirement of that is so that if we go for state funding for any type of facility projects, we have to demonstrate that we have invested in our facilities by showing that we've spent X amount of dollars on an annual basis over 10 years. I think it's 1% of the value of the building that we have to demonstrate that we've spent in required maintenance to show that, you know, we've invested in those in our facilities. We have transportation, which is all inclusive of our student transportation, the salaries, the insurance for those vehicles, the purchase of those vehicles, the repairs, the fuel that is used, as well as the transportation that we contract out through MOESC. You know, all those costs would be categorized under the area of transportation. We have benefits, which is the employee benefits, which include, again, Social Security, pensions, as well as the health benefits, and I'm trying not to read through any of these. The other highlights is the budget is broken down with regard to regular education and special education. So those costs are broken out separately and broken down on a building level so that we can compare buildings on an apples-to-apples basis, so that if one school has more special ed costs, they're not being compared with another school just on the aggregate. Those costs are separated and identifiable. That's because there may be a self-contained special ed program in that school. So these would be the overall categories. That's how the budgets are broken down and tabbed for your reference throughout this process. You know, I mentioned with regard to the chart of accounts, and the one used as the example, the Fund 11, or 11, the first number that tells you which fund it is, whether it's the current expense fund, or if it was a 12, it would be capital. The 190 means that it's instructional or educational, and it's regular education as opposed to special education or undistributed. I know Mr. Nasser sent home, I think he shared with everybody on the board, the minimum chart of accounts, which pretty extensive documents, 200 pages. So if you really wanted to drill down into, you know, all the accounts and, you know, the program codes, the function codes, the object codes, you know, you can do that. What I've tried to provide here are the most common ones that you'll find throughout the budget: the instructional supplies, the media center supplies, as well as the building level administration, and and then with the last one being when you get to capital, which is, again, that's a 12 account. 120 means that it's for regular programs in grades 1 through 5. 100 means that it's for instruction, and then 730 is for undistributed equipment. So each of these numbers has a specific purpose. You're not expected to learn them overnight. You could always reference them, and if you ever have any questions, you don't hesitate to call or email me. Ideally, within the budget projection details report, we'd have a pretty descriptive title or name to explain it. However, we are limited on the number of characters we could put there. That's why there's so many abbreviations, because we try to make it as descriptive, but we are limited with the space that is there. And then the last, on the back of the page, which is going to be the most important, would be the school building location and state codes. So what we do is we break down the cost by building level, and the second to last number or in the account code is our location code, and I provided them there. So when you see 004, that means it's attributed to the high school. 005 is the intermediate school. And what we've been required to do is we've added another subset of codes with regard to the state code, and that's the code that the state has issued each one of our buildings. And that was added 2 years ago, and what the state is looking to do, before they added these additional state codes, districts were really compared on a district-to-district basis, and because that's how the costs were aggregated, such as, like I use as an example, the instructional supplies. You know, so when the state looked at our instructional supply appropriation and expenses, they looked at it district-wide. Now, and even though we had broken it down on a building level, when we submitted to the Department of Education their budget, it was aggregated to the district level. They've now required us to include the building level state code because they're looking to start comparing buildings, school building to school building, not only within districts, but across districts and throughout the state. So that's why we've, our budget, the accounts detailed report used to be 300 pages. Now it's 413 pages because we have that many more accounts that we have to break down at the building level. And if we don't break it down as part of the budget, when we do the audit at the end of the year, the audit sum, we have to take costs that are aggregated to the district at the district level and break them down by building when we submit for the audit sum. But sometimes it's just not warranted to include it at the building level in the budget because because of it's a smaller dollar amount, or it's just more difficult to manage in that regard. But that's the idea of the addition of the state code numbers is so that not only are we being compared district to district, but we're being compared building to building. I know that's a lot, and again, we're gonna, as we go through the process and we have questions, I'll explain the account code for each of the accounts if there's a question that we're addressing with regard to a particular account. And over time, you become more and more familiar because it's not that complicated. But just looking at it for the first time or receiving a document with 413 pages of them is somewhat overwhelming. Anything else on the chart of accounts or the account structure, or with regard to the way the budget is structured in the book? No? Good? Okay. And we also provide the budget projection report, which was in the front of the book. And that does not provide the details within each account, but it does provide the account number, the account description, gives you a history of the last 3 years. For the 2021 budget that we're looking at, it's going to be the 16-17 school year through the 18-19, and those are the actual expenses as reported through the odd sum. And then it provides the original appropriation. So everybody in the front of the book, with the original appropriation, that's what was budgeted in the current school year, the 19-20 school year. So you have history from 16-17, 17-18, and 18-19, and then you have the original appropriation. So that's the 19-20 school year. That's what was originally appropriated. The next column is the current appropriations, which is what is currently appropriated. So during the course of the year, for a number of different reasons, we'll transfer funds from one account to another, and this would be reflective of what the current appropriation is. And then it would show the next two columns, what is currently outstanding in those accounts. That means the funds have been encumbered for those particular accounts and is anticipated to be spent between now and the end of the school year. And then the next column is currently expensed. That is what has been expensed from this account as of February 1. So that the current outstanding and the current expense will be reflective of the end of January, where as of February 1, those numbers won't change as we go through this process. So even though in the current year, the current outstanding and the current expense will vary, will change as we progress through the year, it will not change in the budget projection report, because the way the state looks at it is they compare your projected budget to what your numbers were in your accounts as of February 1. So that's what that's reflected of. And then we have our proposed amount, which is included in the budget, and then the percentage increase. The one thing to keep in mind, and it's important with regard to this report, the proposed percentage increase is a comparison of the proposed amount with the current appropriation. It's not necessarily it's not compared to the original budget or what was budgeted in the current year. So they're comparing what you're proposing to what is currently appropriated as of February 1. So somebody may be saying, well, my budget is flat, and it may be flat from budget year to budget year, but in this report, it may show an increase, a percentage increase, if funds were transferred out of that account for whatever purpose, and the current appropriation is less than what was originally budgeted. Does that make sense? And again, I reiterate it. We'll further review it, but there's certain reports, like when we look at the revenue summary and the appropriation summary, we're comparing budget year to budget year. And that's typically how we're comparing our budgets. However, in this budget projection sheet, through systems, the percentage increase here is comparing it to the current appropriation. As we progress through the process, if it's beneficial to have a line-by-line comparison from budget year to budget year, we can provide that. But that would be a separate document that we would create. And as we progress through, we'll see the need for that if it's necessary. But I just want to make sure it's important that we understand what the difference in the percentages. With regard to the budget report of revenues and appropriations, and this is going to be an example of why it's a working document. What I provided you on Friday was in fact a balanced budget, so the revenues match the appropriations. I just did that for the purpose of balancing the budget. However, this budget, again, we say it's dynamic, and we're going to be in situations where it's not, and we're going to have to make decisions as we progress through the budget. And as we stand today, the appropriations exceed the current revenues. But we're not going to balance it every step of the way. We'll have a balanced budget for the tentative budget when that is submitted, and then, of course, we'll have a balanced budget when we have our public hearing at the end of April and approve a final budget. But with regard to the revenue and appropriations, I provided a backup sheet which broke down the revenues. The first sheet that was provided, we have our tax levy, we have what's available as far as bank tax levy, we have our health waivers, and then the other large categories with regard to tuition, miscellaneous state aid, which is New Jersey state aid, we have federal aid, and then budgeted fund balance and the various drawdowns. What was provided in addition to that was a more detailed breakdown. Does everybody have that? The budget report of revenues and appropriations detail? Okay. It's a page 1 of 2 and it's a page 2 of 2. And yeah, page 1 of 2, and yeah, it's a 2-page document as opposed to the 1-page revenues. It was provided tonight. It was given tonight. It was sent in an email, but it was also a hard copy. It was provided tonight.
I didn't have a hard copy here. I have it in email, but I didn't take it on my computer.
No, we printed one. That's why.
No, I know.
And you don't have one?
No, that's what I'm saying. It's okay. I'm borrowing this.
Oh.
She has one. Never mind. We're good. Maybe she took mine.
Maybe. That's what I was saying. I left them on the table, or
Okay.
Dawn left them.
No, I'm good now.
You got it?
She slid one over.
We're good.
She took the salad fork instead of the dinner.
Got it.
We're good.
Okay, going through the general fund revenues detail. We have the tax levy, that's going to be the same as the summary. We have the bank tax levy of $1,023,828. That is a culmination of the past 3 years of unused spending authority with regard to the tax levy. Districts may bank tax authority or unused tax authority for up to 3 years. After the 3rd year, it expires. So you would lose that opportunity to use that authority. How does bank tax levy get created? One is, don't go to your allowable 2% tax levy. Last year, we went to 0.98% increase, so therefore, we increased our available bank tax levy. The other is to use any of the exemptions or waivers that they have with regard to the tax levy increase, one of them being health benefits. For those costs in excess of 4%, you're eligible for a waiver to the tax levy where you can increase your tax levy above the 2% because of those increase in health costs. If you have an increase in enrollment, if you have a change in responsibilities between districts, there's a couple different ways that you could justify or make application for and be approved for the waiver. Certain ones are automatic, such as the health benefits, and if you don't go to the 2%. So over the past 3 years, we've had spending authority that we haven't used, so that $1 million is available. Don't hold me to the exact figure, but the amount that would expire after this year is a little over $600,000 in tax levies, I believe, which was created 3 years ago, which will expire. But I can follow up on that. With regard to tuition, it's broken down by preschool, private, and other LEAs. And all three are increases. We're increasing the preschool by $16,000, private by $40,000, which partly that's attributed to the residency checks that we're doing and following up where people are paying private tuition now. And then we have the tuition for other LEAs, and that is mainly for special education students. And that's budgeted at $800,000. So our total tuition is just over $1 million. In addition, we have transportation that we provide to other LEAs. We, in a shared service, we look to help out some of the smaller districts in the area, so we budget $5,000 in revenue. We have interest income, rents and royalties, unrestricted miscellaneous, and then we have the demand response program that we participate in, where we shut down our electric in the summer or high demand scenarios when school's not in session as part of that program. So we have miscellaneous income, an increase from $309,863 to $415,000, or an increase of just over $105,000. We break down the state aid, which is $4,602,000 projected, which we anticipate state aid to be flat. That's, for the most part, that's a categorical aid. We have categorical transportation, special education, and security aid. The one variance is the extraordinary aid, and the state has increased funding for extraordinary aid over the last 2 years. You know, we used to budget a higher number, and then they started cutting back on the extraordinary aid. So we had to lower the amount that we were budgeting toward that. But in the last 2 years, they've increased the aid to districts, so accordingly, we've increased the amount that we're budgeting. For years, we budgeted $150,000, and currently we're budgeting $400,000 for the 2021 school year, and it's my understanding that they will continue to fund the extraordinary aid at the current levels that they're funding it. So hopefully that actually follows with the pattern for the last 2 years. So our overall total state aid is, you know, we have it as an increase of approximately $250,000. And just realizing the categorical transportation aid, that's actually, that'll be adjusted with regard to the reduction of $270, because I don't anticipate that to be the case. Federal aid, we have SEMI, which is our special education Medicaid initiative, where we receive funds for services for students that qualify, where those services qualify under Medicaid. So the federal government provides us those funds for that. We're required to budget a percentage or apply for a waiver. That we're not seeking those funds. We never apply for the waiver. You're required to budget, I believe it's 80 or 85% of the amount that they provide you. So they look at your budget, your student population, and they provide the number that we're required to budget. They provide that estimate, and school districts are required to budget 80 or 85% of that number. We budget 100% of the number, because each year we make the application for those reimbursements and we receive 100% of what we've budgeted, and that's been the trend. So we continue to budget the full amount, not a percentage of it. Budgeted fund balance, this would be funds that we anticipate to be remaining at the year end out of the current school year budget that we are going to essentially roll over as a revenue in next year's budget. So at the end of the year, there's going to be balances out of 400 accounts that we have, or the 3 and change. There will be anticipated balances. Those balances in those accounts are first calculated depending on what the district does with regard to putting funds into reserve accounts. We have our allowable 2% surplus that we're able to maintain as a district. But before those calculations occur, as part of the budget, we designate how much we anticipate will be a balance at the end of the year, and we project that as a revenue in the following school year. We do it one of two ways. We either move the funds through the reserve accounts, so we'll budget that we're going to deposit into a capital reserve or a maintenance reserve, as well as an emergency reserve, and then as part of the budget, we budget the withdrawal from those accounts. That's different than the next three lines where it's actually a drawdown from those reserve accounts. When it's a drawdown, those are funds that we have in the account, and say at the current time our balance in the maintenance reserve is $500,000. If we are going to take budgeted fund balance funds and move them in and out of the maintenance reserve, the balance still remains at $500,000. If we do a drawdown on the maintenance reserve of $100,000, the balance after our budget would be $400,000. That's the difference between those two amounts. Designated fund balance is the last line, and essentially the designated fund balance, without getting too complicated, is the budgeted fund balance that's a few lines up that does not go through the reserve accounts. So there's certain restrictions to utilizing the reserve accounts, and if you have budgeted fund balance that exceeds the amount that you can move through the reserve accounts, then that gets budgeted as designated fund balance. And it's the recommendation from the Department of Education that you move funds through the reserve accounts when budgeting from one year to the next year, and your remaining funds go as designated fund balance. But these are the revenues, and other than monitoring what our experience is in the current school year, and the discussion on whether we're going to 2% with the tax levy, if we're going to be below the 2%, or the use of the bank tax levy, there's really not a whole lot of room with regard to the revenues. As far as the local revenues and the state aid, we're not anticipating a significant difference in the state aid that we're going to be receiving. The only other area we will be able to source revenue would be from the reserve accounts. Now, in the past, we've used the emergency reserve to fund our health benefit line. We're not anticipating an increase in our health benefit line account, so we're not going to be able to use emergency reserve funds for that. You can only use emergency reserve funds for health benefits for costs in excess of 4%. We're not going to experience that, so we're not going to be able to use those funds. We may be able to justify using those funds for a security-related purpose, the emergency funds, but that would be, we'd have to seek approval from the Department of Education for that. The maintenance reserve, we can increase the drawdown. I've budgeted $250,000 as a drawdown just to have a starting point at this stage in the process. That can be increased or decreased as we move through the process. The restriction on use of maintenance reserve, you can only use it for that required maintenance that I spoke about earlier, those 261 accounts. You can't use funds from your maintenance reserve for custodial type services or the 262s or grounds or security or anything else in the budget. So there's that restriction. And then we have our capital reserve account, which we can do a drawdown, and those funds can only be used for capital facility improvement projects in the capital account. And the only thing included in the budget at this point with regard to capital facility improvements would be the same amount that we budget in the current year, the $250,000 for improvements for student transportation as part of our shared service agreement with Howell Township. Again, we're still reviewing that part of the budget with regard to capital. We have an F&F committee that will meet as a committee and review the long-range facility plan as part of the evaluation by SPESL, the information that we've received from the building administrators as far as what are priorities to them with regard to projects they'd like to see in their budget, and then we will prioritize those, and they will be included in the capital part of the budget, as well as if certain projects fall into that maintenance category, whether we can move them into the maintenance accounts as well. But that'll work through the F&F committee and be added to the budget as we move forward. However, from an expense standpoint, because we're almost balanced here, we're actually at like $100,000 in the red. Any additional projects we're looking to fund, unless we're using tax levy cap, is going to be funded through the capital reserve. If that makes sense. So that's where we are in revenues. Are there any questions? And we'll circle back, because from a philosophical standpoint, we're going to have to discuss whether we want to, be at 2%, be below 2%, or exceed 2% by use of the bank tax. And I would ask for those comments or discussion on that, so that we have an idea moving forward how we're going about constructing this budget. Are we taking a harder line with regard to different line items in the budget, or is there more flexibility or room with regard to moving forward and preparing it? Good? Okay. I'll move on to appropriations. And this will really demonstrate the limitations with regard to the budget. Because we do mention that salary and benefits are 80% make up 80% of the overall budget. And I broke this down to contract salary accounts, non-contract salary accounts, athletic co-curricular, and then the proposed staff for the 2021 budget. And with regard to the contract salary accounts, those are all positions that have contracts. With regard to the WTEA, those contracts are settled, so we know the salaries for all WTEA members for next year's budget, and they are included in the budget details report. It includes all other contract positions, whether it be WTASC and non-represented, and the cost for what is anticipated as salary increases for those groups of employees is also included in the contract salary or contract salaries, contract salary accounts. And you can see, just going from contract salaries to contract salaries in the year is $1.8 million. That's a combination of the increases that were negotiated, that are part of the collective bargaining agreement, as well as the additional positions that were necessary in the current school year, whether it be for special ed, IEP related, one-on-one paras, or based on additional teaching staff because we had to add an additional section. So, but those are only contract salaries. The next category is non-contract salaries. So that would be overtime that is paid to all staff, whether it be faculty or support staff. It would include substitutes that are hired, as well as non-contract pay that our regular employees receive, such as summer curriculum writing would be a non-contract salary, or additional compensation that is provided over the summer, or that is not included in their quote-unquote contract pay, would be included there. Athletic and co-curricular, pretty self-explanatory. It's the coaches, as well as the stipends that are paid to advisors for clubs, which total little over 984,000. And then we have proposed staff. It's about 6.5 positions, full-time equivalent positions, for a value of $285,714. We'll drill down at future meetings with regard to what those positions are and the rationale. We don't need to do that tonight, but it's staff at the high school, as well as the staff at the high school, intermediate school, and the elementary school. If we want to discuss that in more detail tonight, we can. And the one additional position would be a dispatcher/trainer in our student transportation department. Otherwise, it's teaching staff or family liaison counselors with regard to the proposed staff. But the cost of that additional staff is $285,000.
I have a quick question. I
Sure.
think it's kind of important to discuss which positions it is for, just to give us an idea moving forward.
Okay,
Is that okay? All right.
absolutely.
Okay, sorry.
Gives
I
me an
just know
opportunity to
there's
take a
been a
break and
lot
say, hey, Dr. Gleason,
Sorry.
can you
Well, there's been a lot of
expand?
concern in regards to class sizes, which we've heard from community members. So this is the time then to address that if it is coming down to class sizes that we've heard concerns about. So I just wanted to see if that was.
may I take over from here, Mr. Smith and Mr. Adenizio? Currently, Ms. Mangan, the proposed new positions recommended from the building level are, I'll start from the high school, and then I'll move over down to the intermediate and the elementary school. At the high school, there is a proposed half-time or part-time English teacher, which would then move one of our current part-time English teachers to full-time again. There's also a school family liaison counselor, new position, that would be shared 60% between the high school and 40% at Central School. And that is to handle the increase in student crisis needs, counseling needs, some of the needs around character education and prevention of HIB. At the intermediate school, there is a proposed special ed teacher, and that's to handle the students rising up from the elementary level in self-contained settings. So that would be in our LLD/ABA classroom. At Central School, as I said, that would be the other .4 teacher of the school family liaison counselor that we'll be having at the high school, or recommending for the high school. At Allenwood, there is a proposed special ed teacher, and that's to handle an increase in students needing in-class resource. So that would be a co-teaching setting in grades, I believe it's grades 3 and 4. And then at Old Mill, there is also, it is actually, Mr. Smythe, I think I'm correct that we were losing one section in 5th grade. However, there is a need at Old Mill School to keep that position, since we need an additional special ed teacher also for in-class resource, and that would be through grades 1 through 4. So with regard to your question about is it addressing class size, not necessarily in these recommendations from the building level.
So with that, I mean, and going to what Ms. Megan said, there's certainly an issue at Allenwood School because third grade? Or third grade?
Second and fourth grade.
Oh, it's second, but one of the grades has 25 students per class, I believe it is. And then there was the issue at West Belmar School in kindergarten, I believe it was, moving up to first grade. So I guess my first question is, historically, students, looking at, let's look at West Belmar first, kindergarten moving up to first grade. Generally, do we have an average of like how many kids move out of district and then new kids move into the district going into the first grade situation? Because that might need to be adjusted, because I guess the issue was a class size. Or do we do a co-teaching situation to help alleviate that situation? But certainly, I think the issue at Allenwood School, that grade moving up another level now, certainly 25 students to a classroom seems like quite a few. And that was with other kids being added in, so we don't even know what's going to come up. So I certainly think we need to address those.
So what we'll do is we'll go back and look at current enrollment that's rising to the next grade level. And then, of course, we do have to consider new registrations in over the summer. That could happen. So I'll check on those numbers as we continue to work on the budget with regard to class size. And yes, 25 does get large. From kindergarten, the class sizes are recommended that they're lower at kindergarten, and then they rise incrementally through 5th grade, but not to any great degree,
Right.
by a student or two through 5th grade.
And my next question is the school liaison between the high school and Central School. What do we have going on at Allenwood, Old Mill, and the other schools? Do we have a position now that goes?
Every school has a school family liaison counselor, which has been well utilized at every school. However, as you can imagine, at the high school, some of the needs at the high school have warranted additional counseling. And with Central being our largest enrollment of the elementaries, there's been a need there as well. So between one school family liaison counselor, we think that, allocating that person 60-40 between the high school and Central, that would be sufficient.
And those numbers can be adjusted depending on need.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's being mindful of, where we are with regard to the budget, because ideally, there would be one at the high school and one at Central School. But because, the restrictions within the budget and reviewing it. At this stage, it's being proposed as being split between the two.
And we currently at the high school have 2 school family liaison counselors that have been at the high school, and then we have 1 school family liaison counselor currently at Central School. So this is to handle rising need between the 2 buildings.
So there would be 2.5 at the high school and
There'd be
almost
2.6 and 1.4 at 2.6 at the high school and 1.4 at Central School, correct.
And at Allenwood, we just have one?
We have 1, that's
Okay.
correct.
And Old Mill,
1 at Old Mill, and then also 1
Fine.
at West Belmar.
okay.
Ask a quick question. You mentioned Old Mill, you said that we're losing a 5th grade teacher or something like that, and then we're gonna have somebody who's gonna fill in somewhere in the gap between 1 and 4. What distinguishes that as a new position as opposed to a replacement position? And how that looks in the budget?
It's the way, each position has a unique position code, so a 5th grade regular ed teacher, because there's, I'm gonna make up the numbers, there's 5 sections in the 5th grade, but the 4th grade, there's only 4 sections moving up, so now you have, you only need 4 sections, so there's a position that is no longer needed at the 5th grade level, so you're essentially abolishing that position. However, you've identified a need for a new position in a special ed in-class resource room teacher for other grade levels. And as long as you have the staff that have the certifications to fill that position, it's just an assignment change with regard to within the building. But from a budget standpoint, we're eliminating one position and we're adding a new position. So it's a wash in dollars, but it's, from a unique position code, it's 2 different positions.
Okay, thank you.
Just one. With, is it still too early to know the breakage from people retiring and new people coming in? Is that, do we have anything like that yet?
No.
Okay.
Now, well, actually, we do. The breakage is 0. Because anyone we know that's retiring, we're budgeting them as retiring or resigning, and we're budgeting, let me correct that. It's not 0, it's negative. We're at a loss right now, because we're required to budget vacant positions or new positions at the first step of the guide. However, because of the collective bargaining agreement, you can't always hire at the first step of the guide. If they have X amount of teaching experience, they're required to be hired where they're required to be hired. So, you know, also contributing to the increase in contract salaries from last year to next year, or the current year to next year, is a number of positions that were replacements were hired at a higher salary than the person that left the district, because based on the experience they have and because of the collective bargaining agreement. So even though somebody resigned or left their position, the replacement was actually more expensive than you know, the person that left. And that's just a matter of the contract and something we have to deal with. So right now, I would say it's negative. Breakage is generated once the budget's finalized. So when we no longer start making adjustments to salaried positions, and then somebody gives notice that they're retiring or resigning, and we've budgeted them at $80,000 or $90,000, they're retiring, and then we get a replacement in at step 1 or step, you know, in the mid-50s or 60,000. That's where the breakage is generated. So right now, we don't budget for breakage. We budget to address that. So, and as you go through, you'll see a name, and you'll see vacancy, perhaps with the person's name, and the new salary will be $55,525, because I think that was identified as, you know, the first step of the guide for next school year. So, okay.
Brian, also, you mentioned dispatcher in the transportation department. Can you sort of expand upon that? Are we losing a dispatcher,
No,
or we have additional
we
needs?
used to have the position. We currently do not. We have 2 individuals that work in the office. We have a transportation manager and assistant manager. One works 6 to 2:30. The other one works, that would be Judy. She comes in any time around 9 o'clock, and she leaves when it's time to go home, which could be 6 o'clock at night, could be 7 o'clock at night, depending on different times of the year. It can be significantly later than that. When we have both of them being absent, we bring in a substitute who has been pretty consistent and reliable. That individual is not as reliable as we would like, so we're finding ourselves in a situation where the office is uncovered. We are either sending somebody to the transportation office to cover, or we're having calls forwarded to the business office, and we're handling the radio. Also, because of the arrangement and only working with two individuals in the office, Judy's not able to do some of the things that, you know, as a manager, she should be able to do and spend time, because she's, you know, handling the phones and handling the radio, where this additional position will free her up to be doing some of the more supervisory things that she should be doing, provide coverage when no one's in the office, but as well as when only one of them are in the office. And then in combination, we're either looking for this position to allow Judy or Sandra to provide training to our bus drivers, which we don't really have the ability to provide right now, or depending on the candidate, we would have, perhaps the dispatcher could be a trainer, a dispatcher/trainer. So the position is, you know, as far as identifying what exactly they would do is still up for discussion. But the idea of it is to provide coverage in the office, to allow for training to occur with the drivers, for bringing in new drivers and get them trained, because, you know, as I think everyone knows, school bus drivers are hard to come by, you know, in the state of New Jersey. And, you know, if we can bring people in and train them, whether they have a CDL or not, it would be beneficial for the district, so.
Can you maybe send to the board, or you have the availability to figure out how much money you spent on that substitute throughout the last year, so we can sort of see like a plus and minus there as well? So, okay.
Anything else on staffing or personnel? Okay, going back to the appropriation detail. So out of our budget, we have $48,349,000 is the total amount of salaries in the budget. In addition to that, we have personnel benefits would be the next line item. It's $13,224,000. There's not a whole lot of room for discussion. That includes our pensions, pension obligation, our Social Security obligation, our workers' compensation, a lot of contractual provisions with regard to tuition reimbursement, sick time reimbursement, surrender of health benefits is included in there per the WTEA contract, as well as the health benefit line item. And you see the difference between 1920 and 2021. Bless you. You know, personnel benefits are down $806,000, and that's for one reason only, and that's because of the health benefit line that we're currently still working with the broker, and we're still, you know, massaging that line item number, but it is anticipated that, one, it's not going to be an increase, and we're really pushing for a decrease because, you know, pensions typically goes up, Social Security typically goes up, so the other cost factors go up. But because of, you know, our current year and our experience in the current year with regard to our claims, you know, I'm projecting that we're going to be able to reduce the health benefit line account.
You're next.
Hopefully not. Any questions on personnel benefits? Okay. The other one I broke out was the out-of-district tuition, if you remember at the beginning, talking about the, and again, that's special ed, that's also the vocational students, and those going to the various academies such as communications, biotech, high-tech, would all be included in that number. And the non-salary accounts, or non-salary, non-personnel benefits, and excluding the tuition, we have about $10 million left in the budget, which is purchase services, it's supplies, it's textbooks, and it's miscellaneous. That's really the only outstanding categories that would not be included in the salaries, personal benefits, and the out-of-district tuition. We have purchase professional and technical services, whether it be for educational, like the attorney, the auditor, those are purchase professional services. Special services uses a lot of purchase professional as part of the child study team and for OT and PT. That would fall into that other category of 10 million. Purchase property services, the leasing of copiers would be included in that. Purchase services that are not considered professional in our operations department when we hire a contractor to perform maintenance or service for the school district, they would be categorized under those purchase services. Again, that's part of the 10 million. And then the supplies, and the supplies run the gamut for instructional supplies, building administration supplies, central office supplies, operations, maintenance and custodial supplies, transportation supplies with regard to fuel, the mechanics. So when we break down the supplies and materials, that's everybody. And then the other miscellaneous, we have property insurance, maybe like, trying to think of that category, which is very limited, and then miscellaneous, which is very small number, memberships, and things that don't fall into any other categories. On a percentage basis of the budget, it's about 0% of the budget. So that's where we currently are, and as it's indicated on the sheet, we're $111,000, where we have to either reduce our appropriations or increase our revenues. But again, we're still working with the budget. Numbers are going to change. With regard to the personnel that we propose, there'll be a separate spreadsheet identifying the full-time equivalent, the salary, the location, the description, and then the rationale for the position. That'll be forthcoming, this week, so that we can have further discussion on it at next week's budget workshop meeting, as well as additional information as it becomes available. It'll be disseminated to the Board of Education. Yes.
So Brian, looked at this earlier. So basically, just for my own knowledge, and I think the board and the public, when we're talking, people throw around the $75, $77 million budget. When you talk salaries of all the teachers and the custodians and all that stuff that's kind of baked in, the benefits that are kind of, we're obligated to pay, the tuition that we have to pay for out-of-school districts, for students that we can't house here. You've mentioned it before. It's basically about $10 million that we have left as a board to try to look at to cut expenses. So if we were so inclined to say, we need to look at this, we're limited to 10 million out of the $77 million budget. The rest of it is pretty much baked in that we can't really do much about. That's just a simple fact of the matter.
When developing the budget, yes. Salaries are
What
an
they
outgrowth
are.
of the negotiations, so whatever the collective bargaining agreement is.
Right. So as we enter this process here, it seems to me that we have a couple of different options. We can decide to say, okay, we want, we can go with a 2%, 2% tax levy on what we have, which my first reaction is no, but understanding the reality sometimes. But the second option is, well, we have to really dive into this budget, I think maybe a little bit more than past budgets, and find out where this $10 million is made up of, and to see if there's things that we can cut. And I think what we want to do is, we have this board, there's 9 of us here, and I think we're all committed to doing that, but I think we also have to engage some of our partners in this, which are the principals of the schools, and basically go back to them and say, we need your input. You're getting these different positions which are educationally necessary, but you have to understand the board's perspective too. There's got to be some give and take. So I would think, hopefully going forward, that we can reach out to them. And I guess, my long-winded question is, how much input on the initial budget do you get from the building principals, or is that you putting this one together? I know this is just a general mock-up of the very first one, so I understand this is just a very preliminary working document.
No, With regard to the building budgets, they're done. What would happen now with regard to their budgets, if there's gonna be a discussion on any revisions or questions, why things are included, they could provide additional rationale, and the board, like central office or the board can look to, make revisions to the budgets, because we're not gonna move forward with this program, or we're gonna reduce the amount we're allocating for this program, or for these supplies, You're increasing these services or these supplies, X amount of dollars. Well, you know what? You're gonna have to figure out a way to maintain it flat. With regard to the input into the budget, with regard to the take instructional supplies. Instructional supply budgets are generated and entered into the system by the buildings. We don't enter that. That is done by the building level administrators. So they've met with their staff, their supervisor, or the supervisor for that department is entering the information. And when you go through the budget details, you can actually see the individual who's entering the information, each detail and the anticipated budget amount for that. So it isn't, a broad brush at this point, and, they're still working and massaging it. Their budgets are submitted as they are right now.
And that's not a catch-all, because teachers actually get supplies too, that they bring in. So it's not like we're covering everything.
The additional supplies that teachers purchase?
Yes.
I know that happens. However, it's my understanding we're supposed to develop a budget that
I'm just saying, it's not,
there's additional items that are being provided by the teachers. Yes.
so there's not too much wiggle room, is what I'm saying.
Well, I think it comes down to, with regard to wiggle room, there are increases, and as we continue through this, it's like, let's look at the individual line items. And if we want to look at a building level budget amounts, which we have the ability to do, which this is not broken down that way. This is broken down into the categories I indicated before. But if you want to say, hey, what are all the, break down the cost centers by building. So each school, these are all the accounts associated with this building, salaries, purchase services, supplies, et cetera. What's the comparison from last year, the current year to the proposed budget? And is it an increase? Is it flat? Is it a decrease? And then you can make decisions based on that information, or utilize that information, and that can be provided. But they've been asked to provide these budgets, and there's increases, but I could tell you they're looking to justify those increases because of the courses that are being offered and the supplies that are needed for those courses, or what's the curriculum that's being handed down by the district. And a lot of, when we say the instructional supplies, you have the instructional supplies that are recurring year after year, that are building level entries or building level data, as well as what they want to see for their particular courses or programs. But then you also have the district-wide, and at least Dr. Gleason could chime in at any time with regard to the things that she includes in her budget from the curriculum that applies to all the school buildings, which, again, they can either vary from year to year, or they have increases, but there's a basis for that, or a rationale. We're in year 2 of this, or year 3 of this. Again, the budget revolves back to what we try to talk about is, which maybe part of the handout, I should emphasize it more, the board goals, which, we're still relying on the 1920 board goals, which is tied to the strategic plan. So we're moving ahead with those things, those provisions that were included in the strategic plan. And this budget is pretty much just conforming to that, because there's no real, identified separate initiative that's included in this budget, that, a big item that, hey, this is what we wanted to include in the budget, and so it's in here, that's not there. We're just rolling over everything that we're currently working on. You want to expand on that a lot better than me?
Please? You did a good job, but I'm going to give you a little bit more detail. That was a great question with regard to the principals weighing in. So as Brian said, somewhere the end of January, they submit their building budgets. Primarily, where they have some discretion is around, Brian, I would say between the 610 and the 640 account, would you say primarily, which is their instructional supply and textbooks. Salaries are already built in there. So some of those amounts are rollovers. They might have a 15% recurring rollover every year of textbooks for damaged textbooks, just obsolescence, not necessarily students damaging them. If a student intentionally damages a book, there's a price that goes with that that's paid through the student. But for just obsolescence and wear and tear, every content area, 9 content areas have anywhere from $1,000 to $4,000 of rollover costs. Textbooks cost anywhere from $100 to $250 per textbook. Those are fairly minimal. In addition to that, the supervisors will work with the principals and the assistant principals in each content area to see what are the program needs for that particular content area. So the larger costs are often associated at the high school at the secondary level. So for example, with the engineering academy, you'll see that there are new, sometimes larger purchases when you get into that instructional supply account. That might be for robotics, some of the engineering needs which have a higher cost. And you'll be able to go through each of those budget items, and they've done a pretty good job of detailing those out, what they are. But then you'll also see line items that will just say, instructional supplies to support the technology department or technology curriculum. Those are ongoing supplies that are consumable and that support the ongoing regular curriculum. When you get over into the central office curriculum budget, instructional supplies, also a 610 account, you'll see some accounts that are, or some line items that will look larger that will say, new science curriculum, new math curriculum, and it'll identify the grade span. That's associated with the program evaluations that are currently going on that year. So that's something that's relatively new in the past 3 years since we adopted the strategic plan. Prior to 2017, it's my understanding, because that was before my time, that the district did not have a routine 5-year cycle of evaluating curriculum, and hence you had some curriculum and textbooks that were obsolete by sometimes 10 years and more. So teachers weren't really using them anymore. So we've gotten into a really healthy cycle of evaluating anywhere from 1 to 3 programs of study every year. The teachers lead those. If those of you that have been on the board in the last year have seen the program evaluation presentations by the teachers. And they recommend, they go through vendor presentations, and they recommend the resource that they would like. So that would be a cost, and you'll see those costs within the 610 account for central office. I'm trying to think, okay, so the other thing that Brian brought up that I think is a good point, with regard to new programming, some of the newer academies that are being proposed, or some of the newer initiatives that are being proposed. The Visual and Performing Arts Academy currently doesn't have a significant budgetary impact, meaning that we have not hired any new teachers for this year or for next year for that academy. There's about $2,000 in instructional supplies for the new music theory class, or music academy class that is being offered next year. So there's a cost associated there, and then there'll be roughly $2,500 for curriculum writing in the summer. So I would say, in terms of budgetary impact, maybe $4,000 to $5,000 with that. With the Future Educators Academy, again, there is no significant budgetary impact. We are not hiring any new teachers. We have sufficient teaching staff. The professional development to train those teachers is approximately $1,200 for both teachers this summer. It's a very affordable training. And curriculum writing, again, will be around maybe $2,000 to $3,000 for curriculum writing. So currently, for the 2020-21 school year, those 2 newer and brand new academies will not have a significant budgetary impact. In years 2, 3, and 4, especially the VPA Academy, if we look at digital audio production and those kinds of pathways that have a more significant equipment cost, we would be looking at a larger budgetary impact and potentially staffing. And so I do agree that it might be timely to begin to look at the strategic plan and some of those goals, and as a board, to decide which of those goals and which of those objectives we're holding on, which you would like to move forward with, which of those that I could help advise would have more of a budgetary impact as the coming years. We have to start to look at that. But for the 2020 to 21 school year, there are no significant budgetary costs associated with those two academies or any of the new quote-unquote programs. There are a couple of new courses that I went over this past month with you at the high school. In March, I'll go over a couple of the new electives that are being proposed here at the intermediate school. They'll be handled with current staff. There would be some minimal curriculum writing to write the curriculum for those courses, but relative to the budget, they're not significant impact. They're not a significant impact.
I have a quick question. In regards to online subscriptions, say like Newsela or what's the other one? Measuring Up, are they purchased on a district level or they are individual school-based level?
So what we do, and you'll be able to get a easier handle on that because I pulled all of those accounts to the central office budget. So under purchase professional services, you'll be able to see all of those digital subscriptions. So some of the ones that Erin's talking about are Measuring Up. That's grade 2 through 8 formative assessment system. We pretty much are all digital with most of our assessment systems, as are most districts. And so we handle those through the C&I budget. And Newsela, iReady, almost all of those larger district-wide digital subscriptions. So you'll be able to look at those costs directly when you go into C&I and you look at purchase professional services.
Can I just ask you a quick question?
I'm sorry. Technology acquisitions are handled through the technology department in terms of hardware. So if we're purchasing any Chromebooks to So to add to the supply that we currently have to sort of replace the ones that are as normal breakage, you'll see line items, but that's broken down by school, and technology handles the actual purchase order of each of those. But the schools have those line items within their building budget, and you'll be able to see those at each building level. Christine, I'm sorry, you had a question?
I just had a quick question for you. So at this point, it's kind of a two-part question. In terms of one-to-one Chromebooks, where are we at district level in terms of what grades are now one-to-one Chromebook? That's my first. And then second is, when we're talking about textbooks, are we talking about hard copy textbooks, or are we talking about now online textbooks that they're using with the Chromebooks? Because at some point, are we ever looking at, I mean, I'm not a professional educator, so please don't come and grab me, but are we looking at phasing out hard copy textbooks since the kids are walking around taking the Chromebooks with them?
Okay, I want two really good questions. So the first question is Chromebooks. We are at one-to-one Chromebooks, grades 2 through 12. In grades 6 through 8, they have one-to-one that they carry in the school, so they have their own Chromebook that's assigned to them. At grades 9 through 12, it's one-to-one Chromebooks, and it's a take-home initiative, so they actually take them home. Grades 2 through 5, there are one-to-one Chromebooks because each classroom has a cart, so each student has one, but they're not personally assigned to the students. In grades K through 1, the teachers have 5 iPads per classroom. They're brand new iPads this year, and they use that with iReady. They also still use the technology lab. And they can also share carts, but they're not having their own personal cart. And in kindergarten, it's not really appropriate, the keyboard. They're usually more familiar with the iPads at that level. So that's where we are with Chromebooks. And we have to continue to budget for a certain amount of Chromebooks to keep them on hand for normal just breakage without students doing anything to the Chromebooks. They're Chromebooks, they're not, they're roughly $200 or less per Chromebook, so their life is about 5 to 6 years, but things happen. And then breakage that happens as a direct result of student responsibility, that's when we would use that insurance fee that students have paid for in the one-to-one take-home or carry at the secondary level, both intermediate and high school, if it's not under warranty. If it's under warranty, we'll try to use warranty first.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
So I just need to understand for my own benefit that the area question that you had, Joe, and that we've kind of talked about, is the non-salary accounts where we can look at things a little more critically. Is that correct, first of all? Yeah. Okay. And then it breaks down to schools and district, as we've talked about. But that last page 2 of 2, that generally is the summary of accounts in the district then, right?
Correct.
Okay. Just going on record, I would like for all of us to know that the goals of the district are important in terms of our continuing to make meaningful gain, and it's not that we have to do everything in, the 1 year, especially since the goals are often directed over a course of years. But that's the key point, making meaningful gain, and how do we do that responsibly with the taxpayers' money. So the breakdown of that non-salary accounts area with school, district, and all of that is critical for us to understand. It doesn't seem at this point in time, without that information, that we have a lot of new initiatives, as we've been talking. And that, I think, is important to be said publicly, because there are concerns that we are spending the money wisely and not going crazy in terms of initiatives. And it's already been said. So I don't want to, on the other side of that, I don't want to be not misguided, but short-sighted in terms of saying do more with less. It's not fair to ask teachers or the schools to do that. We've been doing that for a long time. And yes, we have to do due diligence with the review, but considering what I've heard so far, those are the areas I think we have to consider. What are the goals? And long-term, maybe, there are some things that could be put off by a year or something like that, but if we're committed to any goals, whatever they might be, that's the prize. That's what we need to look at.
Yeah, and I would just add that with regard to the, at the building level, the instructional supplies, correct, there aren't a whole lot of new initiatives. It's just that, those departments are looking to have the programs that we currently have and offer fully funded. Because each year, because there's not a whole lot of the budget that's available to cut, that's where we end up cutting. Because it's supplies. We're just going to do a 10% cut on all supplies across, the budget. That can be a big dollar amount, but, especially when you just do a 10%, penalizes different accounts. But that ends up being the area that suffers, because you are limited to what you can do. And I don't want to be misleading with regard to, the salary area, the salaries that you don't have a flexibility in that. You don't with regard to what the salaries are. You do, however, with regard to what positions that we have in the district. So, if that would be an area that we wanted to address, but then we get into class size, and do we want to add another section? Or do we want to reduce a section? You have the ability to do that. Do we want to not offer the certain services that we offer? So there is control with regard to the budget in that regard. However, if we're going to keep the staffing that we have and the service that we're providing, then there's no flexibility with regard to the dollar amount. So I just want to be clear with regard to the board's ability to work within the confines of the budget.
And Christine, I wanted to finish answering your question. I'm sorry. The vendors have gotten pretty clever. To purchase the online, you have to purchase the textbook. So that would be a nice way to reduce costs, but that has yet to appear. And I think there is also still some value in having classroom sets of hard text that students like to be able to, read.
Yeah.
Teachers do.
I'll chime in on that. It's like a balance, you don't want them in front of the screen the entire time. You want to integrate, still that feeling of holding a textbook or an anthology or something along those lines where, they can make meaningful gains by reading context clues and not staring back and forth, flipping between, the computers, but obviously, you want them to be familiar with the integration of technology because all the formal assessments for like NJSLA are computerized now. So, being familiar, but it's like kind of like that healthy balance, so. I don't know.
So I do have a question with that, though. I just thought about it. So we offer textbooks to every student. Do we ever, because things have changed so much now, and kids are so used to computers. Is there anybody that would, maybe if they were asked, would you prefer having a textbook or just doing it on the computer? Has that ever come up? Are we at that point yet? Because, certainly, carrying a Chromebook is a lot easier than carrying a big, history book.
I think that some of the reductions we've been able to do are to use class sets rather than hardcover text for every student.
What do you mean by class sets?
So if a teacher has his or her own classroom, they can have one full class set that they can maintain in the classroom. So there's a individual copy rather than students all, at the secondary level where you might have 3 sections of students coming through. But I think to Erin's point, although yes, they, I think, are, digital, and that is their preferred method of, we assume that because that's their preferred method of doing lots of things that's connected to technology. But I think there's enough research out there that says that it has to be a good balance. And it can also be distracting. And you'll see when we provide the CTAC summary report from our stakeholder group, we did survey student focus groups at the high school and at the intermediate school, and I would say there were equal responses that technology was both helpful and discouraging. So while they're on that for their electronic text for social studies, they can also open up another tab and try to be, on a game or something else that's, not filtered through. And it's a natural distraction. And it's as digital as they are, that's what's happening. So we do want to balance so that they're not isolated behind the screen the whole time. So I think it's about, being, fiscally responsible and educationally responsible in terms of deciding what kinds of instructional supplies are a good balance there.
I like paper.
I do too.
I would have been playing Carmen Santiago. Brian, can I go back sort of to, I don't necessarily where I was at the beginning. Can you just explain again the $600,000 that you said, don't quote me on the exact number, that would expire, and just go over that again, what the options are with that money?
Okay, so with regard to bank cap, you generate bank cap by either not going to the 2% or having a waiver eligibility that, for us, it's mainly health benefits, where our increase in health benefits exceeded the 4%, and it's tied into, it's above 4%, but it's up to what the increase in the state health benefits increase was. So in the years when state health benefits was increasing 10%, districts qualified for a waiver for increases above the 4% up to the 10%. So that became spending authority. So you were able to increase your tax levy, that dollar amount, over the 2% that you were allowed to increase. If you did not utilize that spending authority, then you got to bank it. So and you can bank it up to 3 years. So each year, if you've generated tax levy spending authority, you get to use all 3 of those years in the next year. But as each year goes through, the 3rd year drops off because you have to use it within 3 years. After 3 years, if you didn't use it, it expires.
Okay, and then
So going back 3 years, we generated, I believe the number to be, yeah, and again, that's why I hesitate to say certain numbers, but there's a dollar amount that will expire at the end of this year.
Right. And so, sorry. And so when that expires, that goes back to taxpayers, or is it
No,
just,
that
just
is,
not used,
well,
or?
it doesn't go anywhere because it was never used. So
Okay.
the Board of Education didn't increase the tax levy by that dollar amount. After 3 years, you no longer have the ability to do that.
Okay. And then, so those funds you have allocated throughout the entire budget, or is there specific items where you have it allocated to, or is it just to?
The bank
the
cap,
Yeah,
we're not using the bank. The bank cap's not considered. So at this point, it's not included in the total revenues. And you don't have to, whether you choose to identify to be funding a specific component of the budget or item in the budget, you're not really identifying it because it's just another revenue source to the total amount of revenues to balance with your appropriations. However, if in creation of the budget, we're in the scenario we are now that, hey, we're almost balanced, and we're gonna massage it and we'll eventually be balanced, but we said, hey, we would like to do this, and this is so important to us that, you know what, we're gonna utilize our bank cap. And that's a recurring expense that we anticipate having for future budgets, then that would be justifiable. Then you'd be tying the two together.
Right, I think, Chris, the way I understand it, maybe it make more sense, is last year your budget, you gave it 098 as an increase. You left money on the table. You could have increased your budget by up to 2%, but you elected to do only 098. The difference between 098 and the 2% is a number that you could have taxed more, but you elected not to. So that's the amount of money that would go into the bank cap.
Yeah, last year, our tax levy could have been $500,000 higher.
But you elected
We
not
didn't use
to.
it.
So you didn't do it. So in order to tap into that $1 million that Brian's talking about, you'd have to have this year's tax levy not only be 2%, but it would have to be 2% plus whatever would be required to get us to that 1,028,000. So it would be, 215 or whatever, you know what I'm saying? So that's the kind of money. So it's not money that we have on hand. It's money that we,
Just a clarification, the 215?
I'm just making up a number. It's just whatever, you would have to raise taxes, not only 2%, but you'd have to raise it another X amount, 220, 230, 250, whatever it would be.
The percentage.
The percentage to get it so that you would grab another $1 million worth of revenue.
Correct, okay.
Right? I mean, is that in a simplistic
Yeah, and
way?
just to give you an idea, you'd be like 3.75%.
Okay, yeah, so, right, so,
Because if you doubled it, like, another 1.3 would be another 2%. So we're at $1 million,
Right.
so it's almost another 2%.
right. So I think that's what, so it's money that you could go after, that's way around the 2% cap is really what it is. So,
No, it would be like a 3.75. Because we're at 2% is $1.3 million increase, so another million on the estimate is 1.75% as a ballpark number. So we'd be at 3.75% increase. Well, and you don't need to use the entire 1 million, you could use any portion of it. Or not, which we have not done. If you look at the history, we've not used it in the last 3 years. I think last time we used bank cap was in this, actually, it is on yours, right? 16-17 budget, right? Yeah, it shows it. I had two different reports. So 16-17 was the last time we used bank cap. So if you look in 16-17, the percentage increase was 3.04%. So we went over the 2% because we used $245,000 in bank cap and $387,000 that we qualified because of a health waiver. So we were able to go $620,000 above the 2% tax levy increase, or the 2% cap.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
So I don't know where it is on this paper right now because I'm a little fried, but there was an area that I thought you mentioned where non-salaried, right?
Non-contract salaries?
Say that again, please.
Non-contract salaries?
Yeah, non-contracted salaries, or maybe it was the one under that. Where that, like professional services, consultants, that kind of thing. That might be an area, because sometimes those are services that depending on the amount, but I don't know, my own experience, don't know of any that are really that expensive that you would have to bid on them, but those are areas that maybe we could look at more closely too, you know, in terms of getting either A, a better service agreement, or B, a better, you know, lower price.
Well, most purchase services, if it falls under the professional or extraordinary service, then we do an RFP. And the majority of them are in the areas of special education, but special services does an RFP, and they, for OT, PT, you know, different evaluations, they'll review them and make a recommendation that the board approves. And then the other purchase professional services are the board appointments, such as the architect, the engineers, the attorneys, and the auditor. The other category under a purchase service would fall really under maintenance. The brokers are also in that category. They're considered the extraordinary. They're not professional for the health broker as well as the property and casualty broker. But then the other purchase services would really fall under security or maintenance, and they fall under the public contracts law. So they're either bid, state contract, co-op, or they're quoted. So.
Well, to that point, you know, one of the things that it's not new, it's shared services and talking about that in terms of how, you know, we could network with somebody to get a better bang for that buck or a better pricing.
Absolutely.
One last question, and then I'll be completed. Can you, is there a way that you can identify the difference in the cost from last year to this year in terms of having to now operate the air conditioning systems, so that we can have an idea of how much that additional amount costs in energy and things like that?
No.
No, not at all?
I mean, we can compare our, you know, our expenses on a monthly basis, but there's, you know, other contributing factors such as, you know, the climate or the outside temperature with regard, like from year to year. You know, if you wanted to compare heating seasons, this is not the year to be comparing heating seasons with the last couple of years because it's been so warm. So as much as we can look at what our impact has been with regard to our utilities as far as electric from year to year, there's other factors considered in addition to just adding air conditioning. But because, there's going to be somewhat of a balance, we anticipate that there's going to be probably an overall increase because we're adding so much air conditioning. Where we are replacing air conditioning, we're actually adding efficiency. So that should be beneficial in some regard. But it would be on a overall, what has our utility expenses have been.
Well, the air conditioning, we probably won't, you know, we have a little glimpse of it in September, but we wouldn't really know yet until it starts, you know, getting hot, right? So.
Yeah.
Anybody else have anything? No? Dr. Gleason, do you have anything to add?
No, I would say, though, going back to Mrs. Mangan's point, that it is something we're going to have to go back and talk about with the class sizes teetering, and I would like to review at all of the schools. I believe there might also be a potential class size tipping at Old Mill, either kindergarten or first grade. So we could look at the demographer's study for incoming kindergarten as well as past history, and then also look at the rising classes going up and see which sections, and bring that back to our next discussion.
Great.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Mr. Smythe, do you have anything else?
Only that next Tuesday we'll have another budget workshop meeting. We'll provide additional information between now and then as you know, things develop and materialize. If anyone has any questions during the review, don't hesitate to either call or shoot an email, or if just for a better understanding, you want to stop in and have a review of the budget and the reports and how the information is presented, don't hesitate. I'd be more than happy to provide some explanation.
Mr. Chair, I do have a question about that. In terms of keeping the public informed, how do we do that? Because I have different paradigms in my mind about that, and I don't want them to be out of alignment or incorrect, you know, and there's a public, in April, you said, but at any point before then, is it appropriate or not I don't,
Yeah, so,
like putting it on a PowerPoint or,
the obligation of the Board of Ed is to provide a public hearing, which we'll hold our public hearing on the budget on April 28th. Prior to holding that public hearing, we will advertise the budget in the paper. And we'll also obviously make it available on the website. Now, what is required to be advertised from the Department of Education is a Department of Education level budget, which again is the aggregate and is not 413 pages. They have a requirement, and they refer to it as the advertised budget, which aggregates the different accounts that we have broken down by building into district-wide accounts. That is required to be advertised. We have to publish that in the paper. Prior to that, the next deadline that we have is the submission of the tentative budget to the Department of Education. And that requirement is March 20th, so we'll be scheduled on March 17th to approve a tentative budget. Excuse me. So, and the requirement of submitting to the Department of Education is really for the regulatory compliance and to make sure that not only the numbers and having a balanced budget, but there's a lot of other nuances with regard to the Department of Education budget that we have to submit and show compliance with and provide rationale and justification that we're meeting all these different requirements. That's what we're submitting on, and we have every ability to change the budget, revise the budget up until the public hearing. Excuse me. But when we approve the tentative budget, this becomes a public document, because then it's no longer consultative and deliberative, and we're not discussing and changing the numbers on a regular basis, or this information is no longer being considered in developing the tentative budget. So once the board takes action and approves the tentative budget, that becomes a public record. We put it on the website, and they have all 413 pages that they can review in great detail, and then we start working on the final budget, and that becomes final after the public hearing, and then that budget is what is ultimately published as our final budget. So I guess the short answer would be is March 17th, once the board approves the tentative budget, then we start providing this information in mass, or make it available to the public. Anything that we would like to see in more detail for next budget workshop next Tuesday? Any areas in particular? I don't know that we will meet as an F&F committee prior to that, or if it is, it would probably only be the day before. But again, we're going to be identifying capital projects to go in the capital and what we may include in the maintenance budget. But is there any other areas, like as far as trying to identify, break the cost down by building level? We're going to discuss the personnel and provide additional information with regard to that. There'll be other highlighted accounts where, there's things that we should discuss at the board, such as, in transportation, again, a lot of them are salaries or contracted services, but included in there is the lease purchase of buses, and we're purchasing buses as part of that, even though we're not required to replace a bus. But again, we've discussed this year after year, trying to, because we're constricted with the 2%, we can't have wide variations in individual line accounts if overall we're trying to keep a budget within 2%. So this year we can't have 0 buses being bought, and next year we're going to buy 5 or 6. We do have a year coming up where we're going to have 10 buses that were scheduled that are going to retire. And I'm trying to mitigate that by addressing things leading up to that, so that we try to keep the budget as relatively flat as possible with regard to the purchase of buses. There's a slight increase for the 2021, but again, we can go through detail and discuss that. So there'll be specific accounts that we'll present and bring to the board, but I didn't know if there was any categories.
Yes.
Yes.
And that's the academies and the technologies and the equipment that we're going to be looking for. I don't want to wait until the year. We should be discussing that leading up to it, because I have a feeling that some of that stuff's gonna be expensive. And we have to plan for it. So any information, it doesn't have to be crazy, but like, I don't wanna get caught up like we did with the computers. When we're panicked.
I think that what we could do is put together, with the VPA Academy, I would anticipate that the largest expense that I can see on the nearest horizon would be when we introduce the pathway for digital audio production, which we don't have a confirmed date. I believe it's 3 years out, but that would have a equipment cost associated with that, potentially staffing costs if it's not within the, wheelhouse of one of our current teachers. And then it would also potentially be tied into classroom needs, and that leads us back to, potentially a referendum. Is there building space to house some of these things? So we'll have to decide, the board will have to decide, is that a pathway we want to go down under the VPA Academy? And yes, I agree that we have to put those costs in front of the board well before the year of, or the
And
year
that would be the
before.
proposed, or the ones that we're currently progressing through, as well as the academies that are in place,
Correct.
right? So that we would be looking to identify costs associated with all the academies.
Correct.
Ms. Seitz, do you have something?
I was just curious, in the non-contract salary accounts, you had also mentioned things like overtime. Is overtime spread throughout the budget? I mean, it's probably hits every department. In other words, we don't keep a specific.
We break it down by program, and what you can key in on is the location code is 020. So anytime the second to last segment of numbers is 020, that's for overtime or compensation in addition to contract. Couple numbers, 020 is overtime, 030 is substitutes, and 040 is summer. So I should actually add that to the slide with the building locations, so, which we can do and provide to the board as a cheat sheet.
Anybody, anything else? Seeing none, could I have a motion to adjourn? Got a second?
Second.
All in favor?
All right.
Aye.
Good night, thank you.